Paris, spring of 1755. A man walks into the Hôtel de Soissons, where the Paris Bourse conducts its business. He carries no ledger, no portfolio of bonds. He carries something far more valuable, a sealed letter from Vienna. Inside that letter is information that will move markets. Information about troop movements. Information about alliances. Information that, in the wrong hands, could shift the balance of power in Europe. The man's name is Marquis de Saint-Just, and he is about to transform state secrets into personal fortune. You've been told that financial markets operate on public information, that prices reflect what everyone knows. But what if the most profitable trades are made on what only a few know? You've been told that espionage serves national interest. But what if the spy network itself becomes the instrument of private enrichment? In the coffeehouses surrounding the Bourse, merchants discuss shipping news and harvest reports. They analyze company dividends and royal proclamations. They believe they're operating in a market of imperfect but accessible information. They don't realize that above them, in the salons of Versailles, a parallel market operates, one where information flows not from town criers but from intercepted dispatches, from agents embedded in foreign courts, from ministers who trade in whispers. The Marquis de Saint-Just understood something fundamental about the mid-18th century. Europe was entering an age where information moved faster than armies, where financial instruments could accomplish what cannons could not, where the real battlefield wasn't Flanders or the Rhine, it was the trading floor. He understood that the gap between what insiders knew and what the public knew created an arbitrage opportunity more lucrative than any monopoly trade. What if I told you that the mechanism that would eventually trigger one of France's greatest intelligence failures began not in a foreign capital, not on a battlefield, but on the floor of a stock exchange? What if the seeds of betrayal were planted not by enemy agents but by the very structure of financial incentive? And what if the man who built this system believed, until the very end, that he was serving France? In the next 20 minutes, you'll see how a sophisticated financial scheme built on state secrets created a hidden mechanism of control and corruption. You'll understand why mixing espionage with personal profit creates a system that inevitably self-destructs. You'll see how rational decisions by intelligent actors produced catastrophic outcomes. And most importantly, you'll recognize this pattern, because it's playing out today, in different forms, in ways most people don't notice. Mid-18th century Europe existed in a state of perpetual tension. The War of Austrian Succession had ended in 1748, but no one believed the peace would last. France, still recovering from that conflict, faced a strategic dilemma. Britain controlled the seas. Prussia had revolutionized land warfare. Austria sought revenge. And France, despite its population, despite its cultural dominance, despite Versailles, found itself encircled. The French state operated through a complex web of patronage and privilege. The king's ministers controlled vast bureaucracies, but real power often resided in unofficial networks, mistresses, confessors, salon hostesses who shaped decisions through influence rather than authority. Information was currency in this world, and those who controlled information flows wielded disproportionate power. The Paris Bourse, established in 1724, represented something new in French society. Unlike the royal court with its rigid hierarchies, the Bourse operated on a different principle: price discovery through competitive trading. Shares in the Compagnie des Inns, royal bonds, annuities, these financial instruments created opportunities for wealth accumulation outside traditional aristocratic channels. The exchange attracted not just merchants but aristocrats seeking to restore fortunes depleted by inheritance divisions and expensive court life. But the Bourse operated under severe information constraints. News traveled slowly. A battle in Silesia might not reach Paris for 2 weeks. A diplomatic breakthrough in Vienna might remain secret for months. This information lag created enormous uncertainty, and enormous opportunity for those with faster, more reliable intelligence. The French intelligence apparatus, like much of the Ancien Régime, was simultaneously sophisticated and chaotic. Louis XV maintained several competing intelligence services. The Cabinet Noir intercepted and decrypted diplomatic correspondence. The Secret du Roi operated as the king's personal spy network, sometimes working at cross purposes with official foreign policy. Military intelligence operated independently. Naval intelligence had its own sources. And enterprising ministers maintained private networks funded from discretionary budgets. Into this fragmented landscape stepped Armand de Saint-Just. Born in 1702 to minor provincial nobility, he had risen through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic marriages. By 1750, he controlled one of the king's intelligence networks, not the most prestigious, but one of the most effective. His specialty was economic intelligence, tracking British fleet movements, monitoring Prussian military expenditures, identifying vulnerabilities in Habsburg finances. Saint-Just recognized something others missed. The intelligence his network gathered had two values: its strategic value to France, and its financial value to traders. A report on British naval deployments told the War Ministry where ships were. But it also told merchants which colonial trade routes were vulnerable, which shipping insurance premiums should rise, which overseas ventures would succeed or fail. The same information, the same dispatch, had dual use, patriotic and profitable. The problem, or rather, the opportunity, was that no mechanism existed to monetize this information legally. Saint-Just received his intelligence budget from the royal treasury, a modest sum, always in arrears, never sufficient for the network he needed to maintain. His agents expected payment. His codebreakers required salaries. His couriers demanded compensation for dangerous journeys. The official budget covered perhaps half of actual costs. The rest Saint-Just covered from his own resources rapidly dwindling. He looked at the bourse and saw a solution. If he could find a way to convert secret information into trading profits, he could fund his intelligence network independently. He could expand operations without begging ministers for additional allocations. He could build something more effective, more responsive, more powerful than the ossified bureaucracies around him. And he convinced himself, genuinely convinced himself, that this served France's interests. A better funded intelligence network would produce better intelligence. Everyone benefited. But there was a problem: trading personally on secret state information would be recognized, even in 1750s France, as a profound conflict of interest. So Saint-Just needed a mechanism, a structure that would allow him to profit from his intelligence while appearing to operate a legitimate financial venture. He needed to create distance between the information source and the trading activity. He needed intermediaries, proxies, a corporate structure. He needed to build what would later be called, in hushed tones among those who knew the truth, the Fonds Royal de Confiance, the Royal Trust Fund. In early 1754, as tensions escalated toward what would become the 7 Years' War, Saint-Just made his first move. He approached 6 wealthy aristocrats, men whose fortunes had been damaged by poor investments, gambling debts, and expensive mistresses. He offered them a proposition. He had, he explained, developed a sophisticated analytical system for predicting market movements. By studying patterns in diplomatic correspondence, by tracking shipping movements, by analyzing harvest reports and military expenditures, he could identify opportunities invisible to ordinary traders. This wasn't entirely false. Saint-Just did analyze all these factors. He simply didn't mention that his analytical system included decrypted Austrian diplomatic dispatches, reports from agents in London's financial district, and advanced knowledge of French military planning. The proposition was elegant. These 6 aristocrats would each contribute 50,000 livres, a substantial sum, but not catastrophic if lost. Saint-Just would pool this capital and trade it according to his analysis. Profits would be split, 60% to the investors, 40% to Saint-Just as manager. For wealthy men desperate to restore their fortunes, the promise of returns far exceeding the 5% earned on royal annuities was irresistible. The first trades were modest and brilliant. In April 1754, Saint-Just's fund purchased shares in a shipping venture to the Caribbean. 2 weeks later, news reached Paris that a British naval squadron had been redirected to the Mediterranean, leaving Caribbean routes temporarily undefended. Shipping insurance rates dropped. Saint-Just's fund sold at a 12% profit. The investors were delighted. What they didn't know, Saint-Just had received intelligence about British fleet movements 3 weeks before the public announcement. The trade wasn't analytical brilliance. It was front-running based on military intelligence. In June, the fund shorted, bet against, Austrian government bonds. In July, Austria announced a major military rearmament program, requiring new debt issuance that would dilute existing bond values. The fund profited again. Saint-Just's reputation as a financial genius spread through Parisian salons. By autumn 1754, 12 more aristocrats requested to join the fund. Saint-Just accepted 8, bringing total capital to 700,000 livres. But Saint-Just understood that the fund's size constrained its profitability. Larger trades moved markets, alerting other traders to opportunities. He needed to maintain the fund's exclusivity while expanding its capital base. So he created a two-tier structure. The original investors became trustees, they could see the fund's positions and returns. New investors became beneficiaries, they contributed capital but received only quarterly statements showing overall performance, not specific trades. This structure served two purposes. It prevented too many people from seeing the pattern of successful trades, which might reveal the information source. And it allowed Saint-Just to charge higher fees. Trustees paid 40% of profits to Saint-Just, but beneficiaries paid 50%. After all, they were receiving access to Saint-Just's genius without the privilege of observing it directly. By spring 1755, the Fonds Royal de Confiance managed 1.4 million livres, equivalent to the annual revenue of a prosperous province. The fund had achieved an astonishing 47% return in its first year. In comparison, the most successful merchant ventures returned perhaps 15%. Royal annuities paid 5%. Landed estates yielded 3%. Saint-Just's fund appeared to have discovered alchemy. The mechanism that enabled this success was elegant and terrible. Saint-Just controlled a network of approximately 40 intelligence agents across Europe. These agents sent reports using various routes: diplomatic pouches, commercial correspondence, messages hidden in apparently innocent letters. Saint-Just received perhaps 10 to 15 substantive intelligence reports weekly. Not all were financially useful. But 2 or 3 per week contained information that could be monetized within the window before it became public knowledge. The process worked like this: an agent in London would report on British cabinet discussions about colonial deployments. Saint-Just would assess which French commercial ventures would be affected. If British forces were moving away from a region, French merchant activity there would become less risky, share prices should rise. If British forces were moving toward a region, the opposite. Saint-Just would then instruct his trading proxy, a man named Bertrand Duclos, ostensibly an independent merchant, to execute trades on the bourse. Duclos traded in his own name, so no direct connection to Saint-Just appeared in market records. The timing was crucial. Saint-Just typically had a 2 to 3 week window between receiving intelligence and that intelligence becoming public knowledge. During this window, he had to analyze the intelligence's financial implications, identify appropriate trades, execute those trades through Duclos, and manage position sizes to avoid moving markets so dramatically that other traders would investigate. This required sophisticated understanding of both espionage and finance. Saint-Just had to evaluate intelligence reliability. Was his agent's information accurate? He had to assess market liquidity. Could he trade without revealing his information advantage? He had to manage risk. What if the intelligence was wrong, or if events changed between report and execution? But the system worked astonishingly well, for one fundamental reason: Saint-Just wasn't just passively receiving intelligence. He was actively shaping which intelligence his network gathered. In early 1755, he began directing his agents to prioritize financially actionable information over purely strategic intelligence. An agent in Vienna who had previously focused on military planning was now instructed to also monitor government bond auctions. An agent in London who tracked naval movements was told to note which merchant companies held convoy contracts. The intelligence network, originally built to serve French national security, was being gradually reoriented to serve the fund's trading strategy. This created an insidious feedback loop. The more profitable the fund became, the more Saint-Just could pay his agents. Better compensated agents provided better intelligence. Better intelligence generated better returns. Better returns attracted more investors. More capital meant larger positions. Larger positions meant more profits. And more profits meant Saint-Just needed to generate even more profitable intelligence to satisfy growing expectations. By 1756, the fund managed 3.8 million livres. It had 63 investors, including 2 royal ministers, a mistress of the king, and the Cardinal de Bernis. These investors weren't just passive capital providers. They became advocates, defenders, and unwitting accomplices. They promoted the fund among their networks. They defended Saint-Just's reputation when skeptics questioned his consistent success. And crucially, they used their political influence to ensure Saint-Just's intelligence operations received support and protection. The Cardinal de Bernis, for example, facilitated Saint-Just's access to diplomatic pouches, making his intelligence network more efficient. A royal minister ensured that Saint-Just received advance notice of government financial decisions. Each investor, acting rationally to protect their own investment, helped strengthen the mechanism that would eventually destroy them all. Saint-Just had created something unprecedented, a financial instrument that weaponized state intelligence for private profit, while simultaneously making that intelligence more effective by funding it more generously. It appeared to be a perfect symbiosis. The fund financed espionage, espionage generated returns, returns attracted capital, capital funded more espionage. But hidden within this mechanism were 3 fatal vulnerabilities, invisible to everyone, including Saint-Just, in 1756. First, the system required continuous success. Investors had been trained to expect 40 to 50% annual returns. Anything less would prompt questions, withdrawals, potentially investigation. Saint-Just was now trapped on a treadmill of escalating expectations. He couldn't afford even one bad year. Second, the intelligence network's reorientation from strategic to financial priorities was degrading its actual security function. Agents who once tracked military threats now tracked market opportunities. The network was becoming financially sophisticated but strategically vulnerable. It was optimized for profit, not for identifying genuine threats to French national security. Third, and most dangerous, Saint-Just's success had created jealousy and suspicion. Other intelligence operatives noticed his lavish spending. Rival ministers wondered how a minor aristocrat maintained estates, mistresses, and influence disproportionate to his official position. And in London, British intelligence had begun noticing patterns in French market activity that suggested information leakage. In spring 1756, a British intelligence officer named Thomas Pelham wrote to his superior, "The French appear to possess advanced knowledge of our naval movements with disturbing regularity. Either their intelligence capabilities have dramatically improved, or there exists a breach in our communications security." British counterintelligence began investigating. They didn't yet know about the Fond's royal de confiance. But they had detected the shadow it cast across markets. They had seen the traces of informed trading. And they began hunting for the source. What neither Saint-Just nor British intelligence understood yet was that someone else had noticed the pattern too, and was preparing to exploit it for their own purposes. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, not related to the famous minister but deliberately using that aristocratic connection, served as Saint-Just's primary agent in London. Posted nominally as a commercial attaché, Colbert operated what spies call a resident agent, someone with official cover but unofficial mission. His task: gather intelligence on British naval movements, commercial ventures, and financial market sentiment. He reported to Saint-Just twice weekly through encrypted correspondence hidden in wine shipment documentation. What Saint-Just didn't know, Colbert had been approached by British intelligence in 1755. Not arrested, not confronted, approached. The British had identified him as a French agent but had made a calculated decision. Rather than expel him, they would turn him. They offered Colbert something irresistible, £2,000 annually, more than triple what Saint-Just paid him, plus protection, plus eventual resettlement in Britain with a comfortable pension. Colbert accepted. But he was sophisticated enough not to immediately betray his network. That would end his usefulness to both sides. Instead, he continued providing Saint-Just with accurate intelligence, while simultaneously providing British intelligence with copies of everything he sent to Paris. This accomplished two objectives for the British: it identified the extent of French intelligence penetration, and it allowed them to track which intelligence Saint-Just considered valuable enough to act upon. By early 1757, British intelligence had developed a comprehensive understanding of Saint-Just's operation. They knew about the fund. They had identified several investors. They understood the trading patterns. And they made a bold decision: they would weaponize Saint-Just's own system against him. In March 1757, Colbert received new instructions from his British handlers. He was to continue providing intelligence to Saint-Just, but now he would gradually introduce subtle distortions. Not obvious fabrications, those would be detected, but slight exaggerations, minor timing errors, selective emphasis on information that would lead to profitable trades in the short term but catastrophic exposure in the long term. The first test came in April 1757. Colbert reported to Saint-Just that British naval intelligence suggested a major fleet deployment to the Mediterranean, leaving Atlantic approaches vulnerable. This intelligence was technically true, there was such a plan. What Colbert didn't mention: the plan had been discussed but not approved. It was a contingency, not an operational order. Saint-Just analyzed the intelligence and saw opportunity. If British Atlantic defenses weakened, French merchant shipping would be safer. He instructed Duclos to purchase shares in several French merchant companies with Atlantic routes. The fund committed 400,000 livres to these positions. 2 weeks later, the British cabinet cancelled the Mediterranean deployment. Atlantic fleet strength remained unchanged. French merchant companies, expecting safer passage, found their shipping facing the same British naval pressure as before. Insurance costs rose. Share prices fell. The fund's Atlantic positions lost 18%. For the first time in the fund's 3-year history, it reported a quarterly loss. Not catastrophic, the fund had other profitable positions that quarter, but disturbing. Investors demanded explanation. Saint-Just assured them it was an analytical error, a misreading of British intentions. He promised to refine his methods. Privately, he questioned Colbert's intelligence but had no reason to suspect betrayal. Intelligence was always imperfect. Sometimes analysis failed. But Colbert's British handlers were watching carefully. They had successfully fed disinformation through Saint-Just's network. Now they prepared for Phase 2. Meanwhile, another threat emerged closer to home. Madame Elise Fontaine, Saint-Just's mistress of 4 years, had access to his private offices in the townhouse he maintained near the Palais Royal. Elise was intelligent, observant, and increasingly angry. Saint-Just had promised to marry her after his wife's death. But his wife remained inconveniently healthy, and Saint-Just's attention had recently shifted to a younger woman at court. In July 1757, while Saint-Just attended a ministerial meeting at Versailles, Elise entered his private study. She had watched him work there countless times, knew his habits, knew where he kept his most sensitive documents. She found his correspondence with Colbert. She found trading records. She found evidence of the intelligence-to-trading pipeline. Elise wasn't educated in finance or espionage, but she understood leverage. She confronted Saint-Just that evening with a simple demand: either marry her, or she would deliver these documents to the Marquis d'Argenson, the foreign minister and Saint-Just's bureaucratic rival. Saint-Just tried charm, tried promises, tried explanation. Elise was unmoved. She gave him 1 week to decide. Saint-Just was now trapped between two converging threats, though he fully understood only one. He knew about Elise's blackmail. He didn't yet know about Colbert's betrayal. And he was about to face the crisis that would destroy everything. In August 1757, Colbert sent an urgent dispatch. British intelligence had discovered plans for a major French naval operation, a fleet deployment to engage British forces near Quiberon Bay. The operation was scheduled for early November. The intelligence appeared specific, sourced from multiple agents. If accurate, it represented a massive French commitment, 30 ships of the line, the most significant naval engagement France would attempt in years. Saint-Just analyzed the implications carefully. If the French operation succeeded, French naval stocks would surge. France would control western approaches, British trade would be disrupted, insurance costs for French shipping would plummet. It would be the most significant trading opportunity since the fund's creation. But there was enormous risk. If the operation failed, if the French fleet was destroyed, the consequences would be catastrophic, both financially and personally. The fund had grown to 5.2 million livres. A significant position in naval-related securities could represent 40 to 50% of the fund. If those positions collapsed, the fund would face redemption demands it couldn't meet. Investors would investigate. The mechanism would be exposed. Saint-Just needed to assess the French fleet's probability of success. And here his dual role created a terrible conflict. As an intelligence officer, he had access to internal French naval planning. He knew something his fund investors didn't know, something that should never be used for trading purposes. The French fleet was unprepared. Ships that should have been refitted hadn't been. Supply chains were compromised. The officer corps was divided by personal rivalries. The British Navy, despite what Colbert's intelligence suggested, maintained superior positioning. Saint-Just looked at the actual operational plans and saw a disaster waiting to happen. Here was the moral choice that would define everything. Saint-Just could reveal his concerns to French Naval Command, potentially saving the fleet but exposing his access to information he shouldn't possess for trading purposes. Or he could use this information to position the fund to profit from disaster, either by avoiding losses or by actively betting against French success. He made a third choice, one that seemed rational in the moment but was actually the worst option. He decided to reveal nothing and position the fund neutrally, neither heavily committed to success nor betting on failure. He would not warn the fleet command because that would raise questions about his sources. He would not inform his investors because that would undermine confidence in the fund. He would wait, see what happened, and manage the consequences afterward. But Colbert, receiving instructions from his British handlers, had been telling Saint-Just that the French naval operation was extraordinarily well prepared, that British defenses were weak, that French victory was nearly certain. From Colbert's false intelligence, the rational trade was to heavily buy French naval-related securities. Saint-Just, trusting Colbert's assessment more than his own knowledge of French unpreparedness, because Colbert was supposed to know British dispositions, made the fatal decision. In September 1757, the Fonds Royal de Confiance committed 2.1 million livres to positions that would profit from French naval success. On November 20, 1757, the Battle of Quiberon Bay occurred. The French fleet was annihilated. 22 ships were destroyed or captured. Thousands of French sailors died. It was one of the worst naval defeats in French history. The fund's positions collapsed. Securities purchased at premium prices became worthless overnight. The Fonds Royal de Confiance lost 2.8 million livres in a single day. Investors, who had trusted Saint-Just with their fortunes, faced financial ruin. Within 72 hours, the Cardinal de Bernis confronted Saint-Just, demanding explanation. How could the fund's sophisticated analytical system have produced such catastrophic failure? Other investors followed. The questions became accusations. And someone, historians never determined who, suggested to French counterintelligence that perhaps they should investigate whether Saint-Just's trading success had been built on misappropriated state intelligence. The investigation that followed revealed the elegant and terrible architecture Saint-Just had built. Counterintelligence agents, searching Saint-Just's offices, found 3 years of trading records cross-referenced with intelligence reports. The correlation was impossible to deny. Every significant fund profit corresponded to an intelligence report received 2 to 3 weeks earlier. But the revelation went deeper. As investigators interviewed Saint-Just's intelligence agents, they discovered something more troubling. Several agents had been reoriented from strategic to financial intelligence gathering. One agent testified that in 1756, Saint-Just had instructed him to prioritize information about British merchant shipping over information about British military planning. Another revealed that Saint-Just had rejected a promising recruitment opportunity, a potential source with access to British war plans, because that source had no access to financial information. The investigation concluded that Saint-Just had systematically corrupted French intelligence operations, degrading their strategic effectiveness in order to enhance their financial utility. This wasn't merely insider trading. This was transformation of state security apparatus into a private profit engine. But the most devastating revelation came from Colbert. Once Saint-Just's betrayal was exposed, British intelligence calculated that Colbert's cover was compromised. They extracted him from France and publicly revealed his role. Colbert, safely in London, published a detailed memoir describing the entire operation, how he had fed disinformation to Saint-Just, how Saint-Just had used intelligence for trading, how the fund had operated. The memoir appeared in London newspapers in January 1758. It was immediately translated into French and distributed, illegally, throughout Paris. The scandal was unprecedented. A senior French intelligence officer had been operating a private investment fund based on state secrets. He had reoriented intelligence operations for personal profit. And he had been so effectively manipulated by British intelligence that he had led French investors to financial ruin while simultaneously compromising French strategic intelligence. The political implications were catastrophic. France was fighting the 7 Years' War. They were losing. They desperately needed effective intelligence. And now it was revealed that one of their intelligence networks had been penetrated, that their spy chief had been compromised by financial incentives, that British intelligence had weaponized French greed against French interests. The king's ministers faced an impossible dilemma. They needed to punish Saint-Just to restore credibility. But a public trial would expose the full extent of the disaster, would reveal that senior aristocrats, royal ministers, and even the Cardinal de Bernis had invested in a fund built on stolen state intelligence. It would show that the French intelligence apparatus was so poorly supervised that one man could redirect an entire network for 3 years without oversight. The solution was typically ancien régime, disappear the problem. On February 8, 1758, Saint-Just was arrested quietly at night. No public charges. No trial. He was taken to the Bastille and held in isolation. 6 weeks later, prison records show him dying of apoplexy, a conveniently vague diagnosis that could mean anything from stroke to poison. He was 56 years old. His death was announced in a brief official notice as occurring from natural causes. His property was seized, not officially as punishment, but supposedly to settle debts. His investors received nothing, the fund was declared bankrupt, its remaining assets absorbed by the royal treasury. Most tellingly, Saint-Just's name was systematically erased from official documents. Intelligence reports he had authored were reattributed to subordinates. Ministerial correspondence with him was edited or destroyed. Within 5 years, his name appeared nowhere in official French records. The 63 investors who had entrusted their wealth to the Fonds Royal de Confiance faced varying fates. Some, like the Cardinal de Bernis, had sufficient independent wealth to absorb the losses, though they faced political damage and social humiliation. Others were financially destroyed. 3 committed suicide. 7 fled France to avoid creditors. The rest lived diminished lives, their fortunes and reputations permanently damaged. But the most sophisticated mechanism emerged not from the fund's collapse but from the system the Crown created to prevent recurrence. In 1759, the Royal Council established the Bureau de Surveillance de Renseignements, the Intelligence Oversight Bureau. Its official purpose was to coordinate intelligence activities and prevent duplication. Its actual purpose was to ensure no intelligence officer could ever again operate independently with the freedom Saint-Just had enjoyed. The Bureau created something unprecedented, a centralized system for tracking intelligence reports, cross-referencing sources, monitoring agent communications, and auditing intelligence officers' personal finances. Intelligence chiefs had to submit quarterly financial statements. Their trading activities were monitored. Their agent networks were subject to random inspection. It was a surveillance system built to watch the watchers. This system proved effective at preventing another Saint-Just situation. But it had an unintended consequence: it made French intelligence rigid, bureaucratic, and risk-averse. Agents who had previously operated with autonomy now required approval for routine decisions. Intelligence officers who might have pursued innovative recruitment strategies now followed prescribed procedures. The system became more accountable but less effective. British intelligence, observing these changes, noted with satisfaction that French intelligence capabilities appeared to decline after 1759. The Colbert operation had accomplished more than exposing one corrupt officer. It had triggered systemic reforms that made French intelligence less nimble, less responsive, less dangerous. Was Saint-Just's corruption unique to 18th-century France? The pattern appears with disturbing regularity throughout financial history. The mechanism, using privileged information access for trading profit, recurs across different contexts and centuries. In the early 1700s, the Bank of England's directors traded bank shares based on internal information about dividend payments and financial stability. Research on early 18th-century equity markets reveals that corporate insiders consistently outperformed outside investors by approximately 7% annually, not through superior analytical skill, but through access to material non-public information. In April 1720, as the South Sea bubble approached its peak, Bank of England insiders dramatically increased their purchases of bank shares, having internal knowledge that the bank's competitor would soon collapse. Fast forward to the 1980s, Ivan Boesky and the insider trading scandals that shook Wall Street followed the same pattern. Boesky cultivated sources inside investment banks and law firms who provided advance knowledge of mergers and acquisitions. Like Saint-Just, he appeared to possess uncanny market timing. Like Saint-Just, he was eventually caught when investigators noticed statistically impossible patterns in his trading success. Like Saint-Just's fund, Boesky's operation collapsed when the information source was compromised. The 2008 financial crisis revealed another iteration. Hedge fund managers cultivated sources inside pharmaceutical companies to gain advance knowledge of drug trial results. They paid expert networks that were essentially information laundering operations, physicians and researchers who shared material non-public information under the guise of consulting. When prosecutors finally investigated, they found the same structure Saint-Just had built, multiple layers of intermediaries designed to create distance between information source and trading activity. But the pattern extends beyond pure financial fraud to cases where intelligence and finance intersect, Saint-Just-specific innovation. In the 1990s, Russian intelligence officers used classified information about energy policy and central bank decisions to guide trading by oligarchs who, in turn, funded intelligence operations. The symbiosis was remarkably similar: intelligence enabled profit, profit funded intelligence, until the system became so corrupted it served neither intelligence nor national interest effectively. Why does this pattern repeat? 3 structural factors make it nearly inevitable. First, information asymmetry creates arbitrage opportunities. Whenever some actors know more than others, the informed can profit from the uninformed. This is true whether the information gap involves corporate earnings, government policy, or military intelligence. Second, the gap between when informed actors learn something and when the market learns it creates a time-based arbitrage window. Saint-Just typically had 2 to 3 weeks. Modern insider traders might have only hours or minutes. But the structural dynamic remains identical. Third, the profits from informed trading are large enough to justify significant risk. Saint-Just's fund achieved returns of 40 to 50% annually. Modern insider trading can generate similar multiples of market returns. The financial incentive to abuse privileged information is powerful and persistent. The contemporary relevance extends beyond financial markets into national security concerns. Today's cybersecurity professionals often possess knowledge about vulnerabilities in widely used systems before those vulnerabilities are publicly disclosed or patched. This knowledge has obvious trading value: short the affected company's stock, or inform competitors who benefit from the vulnerability. The structural temptation Saint-Just faced confronts every intelligence professional who possesses information with market implications. Consider a more current scenario: intelligence analysts who monitor satellite imagery of Chinese manufacturing facilities possess advanced knowledge of production levels that will eventually be reflected in corporate earnings reports. They know which factories are expanding, which are reducing output, which are switching product lines. This information, if used for trading, would be extraordinarily valuable. That analysts generally don't use it reflects regulatory prohibitions and professional ethics, but the temptation is structural and permanent. The most sophisticated modern parallel involves algorithmic trading firms that purchase privileged data access. These firms don't hack intelligence networks, but they buy information that's functionally similar: satellite imagery of retail parking lots to predict sales, credit card transaction data to forecast revenue, shipping manifold data to project inventory levels. They've created a legal version of what Saint-Just did illegally, converting privileged information into trading advantage. The information sources are different, but the mechanism is structurally identical. The Saint-Just case teaches a critical lesson about system design: mixing intelligence and profit creates corrupting incentives that degrade both functions. Intelligence operations require prioritizing national security over financial return. Profit-seeking requires prioritizing financial return over other considerations. When the same person or organization tries to serve both masters, the financial incentives typically dominate because they're immediate, quantifiable, and personal, while national security benefits are diffuse, long-term, and collective. This lesson has contemporary policy implications. Should intelligence agencies be allowed to invest their pension funds in markets they monitor? Should national security officials be permitted to hold significant equity positions in defense contractors whose contracts they approve? Should regulatory enforcement agents trade in industries they regulate? Current ethics rules generally prohibit these activities, but the prohibitions exist precisely because the Saint-Just pattern is recognized as a persistent temptation. The broader pattern Saint-Just exemplifies is this: privileged information creates opportunities for private profit that can corrupt public functions. This pattern appears in intelligence operations, financial regulation, corporate governance, political office, and anywhere else that power creates information asymmetry. The specific manifestations vary, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. And it's operating today, in multiple contexts, often legally or in jurisdictions with inadequate oversight. The formal story of the Marquis de Saint-Just ended in 1758 with his death in the Bastille. But the financial consequences extended for decades. The Fonds Royal de Confiance's bankruptcy created a cascade of secondary failures. Investors who had borrowed to invest in the fund defaulted on those loans. Creditors who had lent to those investors faced losses. Several French banking houses that had extended credit backed by fund shares nearly collapsed. The total economic damage exceeded 12 million livres, roughly equivalent to 1/4 of France's annual revenue from customs duties. More significantly, the scandal damaged confidence in French financial markets at precisely the moment France needed to raise war financing. Investors who had been burned by the fund's collapse became skeptical of all investment opportunities. The Paris Bourse's trading volume declined by 40% between 1758 and 1760. France's ability to fund the 7 Years' War through private capital was compromised, forcing greater reliance on debasing currency and raising taxes, policies that ultimately contributed to the fiscal crisis that sparked the French Revolution 3 decades later. The intelligence consequences were equally significant. The Bureau de Surveillance created to prevent another Saint-Just made French intelligence more accountable but less effective. During the remaining years of the 7 Years' War, French intelligence failed to anticipate several major British operations. The rigid oversight system prevented individual initiative and risk-taking. By trying to eliminate corruption, the reform created ossification. Saint-Just's story teaches something fundamental about institutional corruption. Financial incentives don't just create individual malfeasance, they corrupt entire systems. When Saint-Just began using intelligence for trading, he didn't simply betray his office. He gradually reoriented his entire network toward financial rather than strategic priorities. His agents adapted their collection priorities. His analysts focused on financially actionable intelligence. The corruption became systemic because the incentives were structural. This systemic nature makes the Saint-Just pattern particularly dangerous and difficult to prevent. You can prohibit individual officers from trading. But if the underlying structure creates financial incentives for information abuse, people will find ways to exploit those incentives. The solution isn't just rules against abuse, it requires removing or redesigning the incentive structures that make abuse profitable. The Saint-Just case also reveals something about the nature of betrayal. Saint-Just almost certainly believed, until late in his operation, that he was serving France's interests. A better funded intelligence network would produce better intelligence. The fund enabled him to recruit more agents, pay them better, expand operations. He convinced himself that the personal profit was a side effect of patriotic service. This self-justification is remarkably common among those who betray public trust for private gain. They construct narratives where personal benefit and public interest align, narratives that become increasingly implausible to everyone except themselves. The final lesson is about visibility and concealment. Saint-Just operated his scheme for 3 years before exposure. During that time, he appeared brilliantly successful. His investors praised his genius. His intelligence network expanded. His influence grew. Only in retrospect did the corruption become obvious. This delayed visibility is characteristic of information-based fraud. Unlike theft of physical property, theft of information leaves no immediate evidence. The crime is invisible until the pattern becomes statistically impossible to ignore or until an insider reveals the mechanism. If history teaches us anything from the Marquis de Saint-Just's rise and fall, it's this: we should pay attention when those with privileged access to information achieve extraordinary financial success. We should question whether their analytical genius might actually be information advantage. We should watch for institutional capture, when organizations that should serve public purposes gradually reorient toward private profit. And we should recognize that mixing intelligence and profit creates corrupting incentives that almost inevitably degrade both functions. Because the pattern is old. The incentives are structural. And somewhere, right now, someone with access to privileged information is making the same calculation Saint-Just made in 1754, convincing themselves that private profit and public service can align, that extraordinary returns reflect analytical brilliance rather than information advantage, that they can manage the risks and avoid the consequences. History suggests they're wrong. But the pattern continues, because the incentives persist, and human nature remains constant.